Citizens' rights have indeed been a top priority for both sides, not just for the UK. And it was the first topic that we really got into in the negotiations last year. And we made more progress on that issue more quickly than on any other area. And I think that showed that there was a strong political will on both sides to make progress on that issue. Some of you may have looked over the agreement that was actually struck in December. And overall, I would argue that this is good news for UK nationals in Germany. Your rights and those of your family members in particular to continue to live in Germany will be protected under the withdrawal agreement. And specifically, we have agreed the following with our European partners. Brits that have been in Germany for 5 years will be granted permanent residence, and citizens will only lose this status if they leave Germany for more than 5 years. Those that have not completed 5 years here by March the 29th, 2019, the day that the UK leaves the EU, they will have the right to continue to stay here to complete a 5-year residence period and transform their status into permanent residence. The December text also covers frontier workers, that is, people who live in one EU country but work in another EU country. Their rights will also be protected if they were working across borders on exit day. And the rights will be protected for as long as they retain that status of being a frontier worker. I know also that the right to bring your family members to Germany has been a major concern for some of you, and I'm pleased that we've also reached agreement on this matter. Family members of any citizen who falls within the scope of the withdrawal agreement will retain the right to move to that citizen's place of residence for the duration of that citizen's life. And this applies to parents, partners, and children, including children who are born after exit day. The definition of partners includes people who are in a durable relationship, but the relationship must have started before Brexit and still be continuing. And family reunification of others in other categories, those not mentioned, will be governed by national law after Brexit. On social security, the lifetime export of state pensions will continue, and pensions will continue to be uprated as they are now. Aggregation rules for pension contributions prior to Brexit will also be maintained for the lifetime of all those who have contributed to pension schemes in another EU country than that of their residence at any point in the past. So, for example, if you've contributed to the public schemes in Germany and the UK, you will continue to receive both pensions via application in Germany, as you do now. And we also agreed to continue current healthcare arrangements for those citizens who are resident in Germany by March the 29th, 2019. And this applies to all types of reciprocal healthcare, including EHIC, planned treatments, and healthcare reimbursement arrangements for pensioners. The right to export benefits, such as child benefit, will continue as under current EU rules. I understand that, particularly for those of you who are self-employed, the continued mutual recognition of qualifications is very important. And this has been confirmed for cases where recognition decisions have already been made, or where recognition procedures are ongoing at the date of the UK's leaving the EU. There are a number of issues which the Commission deemed to be outside the scope of this phase of the negotiations, including some important rights such as home title practice for lawyers and the status of licenses and certificates. And talks on those areas will continue into the next phase of the negotiations. You will keep your right to establish and run a business in Germany. So that was a summary, a short summary of what was agreed in December. And the overall aim of both sides, I think it is fair to say, has been to allow citizens, British citizens in the EU and European citizens in Britain to continue to live their lives much as before, and that remains a high priority. We know that there are some issues on citizens' rights that we pushed hard in the first phase of negotiations, but were unable to conclude agreement, as the EU's position was that they did not have a mandate to negotiate on those particular issues. And we know that that includes some important issues for UK nationals, so we will continue to raise those issues as the negotiations progress. For example, we know that the right to continue to live and work in all EU 27 countries, known as onward movement rights, that is of great importance to some of you. And in order to try to secure that, the UK side actually offered the European Commission a lifetime right of return to the UK for qualifying EU citizens, but unfortunately the EU side, the EU 27, did not actually take up that offer in the negotiations. So that issue remains unresolved, and we will continue to raise it as negotiations progress. We have also not yet agreed healthcare arrangements for those moving after March 2019. And again, the UK will push for current arrangements to continue to the benefit of citizens in all of our countries. And lastly, there are some outstanding questions on mutual recognition of qualifications, as well as economic rights, including future arrangements for posted workers. And those are employees who are sent by their company to work in another member state for a limited time period. And we will continue to raise those issues and return to them too in the next phase of negotiations. Right, before I wind up this introduction, I just want to say a few words about next steps in the process. Firstly, I want to reiterate that rights under the withdrawal agreement, your rights under the withdrawal agreement, will be protected for all British nationals who have moved to Germany before the 29th of March 2019. And to ensure that the system has a record that you qualify for those rights, we would encourage you to make sure that you're registered by the German authorities as living here in Germany. We're negotiating the terms of an implementation period, often referred to as a transition period, following our exit from the EU, and probably lasting about 2 years. The details of this implementation period are still being worked out between the EU and the UK. And it is clear that during this implementation period, British nationals will still be able to move to Germany, as will EU citizens still be able to move to the UK. However, the rights of those people who arrive during the implementation period, once the period ends, that is still a matter to be negotiated. Experts are also currently working on drafting the legal text for the withdrawal agreement, which will include, of course, a chapter on citizens' rights, encapsulating what we have agreed between us. And that process of legal drafting, casting in legal language, is likely to take a few months. But it's important to remember that the December report represents a very strong political commitment from which neither side wants to depart. The European Council next month, March the 22nd and 23rd, will, we hope, agree the EU 27's negotiating mandate for the future partnership between the UK and the EU, so that we should be able to begin to discuss those outstanding issues such as onward movement rights, which I mentioned earlier. We should be able to begin those discussions in that next phase of the negotiations soon. And as I said at the outset, we will continue to update you both through our social media channels, through our UK and Germany website, as well as at future events like this. And I will say it one more time, that I just want to reiterate how important your rights are to the UK government. And we understand that this is a difficult time, a time of uncertainty for you and for your families, but we're working very hard to ensure that you're able to continue to live your lives as you have been doing here in Germany. And now I'm going to hand over to Jane.
Thank you very much. I'm Jane Golding. I'm the chair of British in Europe, and maybe some of you will know that we have been running a very intense advocacy campaign along with the largest group of EU citizens in the UK, the 3 million, to safeguard the rights of UK citizens in the EU and EU citizens in the UK. My presentation will be a little bit different to the ambassador's. I mean, I'll confirm some of the things that he said, but my main message is that citizens' rights are not resolved yet. And I'll explain why. British in Europe is a coalition of 10 core groups with other groups in smaller countries as well involved, with members of about 30 to 35,000. Just to give some statistics about British in Europe, who we all are, I mean, nearly 80% of us are working age or younger, and you may also be interested to know that nearly a third of us are in fact between the ages of 30 and 49, and that's quite important to what I'm going to go on and say. British in Germany, the group here in Germany, which I co-founded with Daniel Tetlow, is one of the core groups of British in Europe. And we've now got groups in cities across much of Germany, in Berlin, Hamburg, Munich, Frankfurt, to name a few. So on citizens' rights, as I said, in our view, citizens' rights are not resolved. And here what we're talking about is all the people who've moved before the UK exits the EU. So we're talking about the people who we believe, and this is our core principle, should not be negatively and retrospectively affected by the exit of the UK from the EU. And that's because we've all gone in good faith to move to another country with the legitimate expectation that our rights were for life, that they were irrevocable. So how do we see the negotiations and how they have played out over the last year? Well, the negotiations started in May last year with the EU putting out its negotiating directives and essential principles on citizens' rights, and we were reassured to see that at that point it seemed the EU's proposal was to confirm our existing rights. The negotiations began. There was a counter-proposal from the UK, which mostly related to the immigration status of EU citizens in the UK. Then, as the negotiations continued, inevitably there were compromises and the EU position worsened. Nevertheless, we do recognise, as British in Europe, that there was some progress in 2017. However, the joint report that came out in December remains a common understanding which was reached in order to show sufficient progress and move into the next phase. It's not a final agreement yet, which is why I say citizens' rights aren't resolved yet. And we were particularly disappointed with one thing in the joint report, and that was that the joint report seemed to qualify our rights by the concept of life choices. But we had understood that it was our rights that were to be protected by both sides. After all, rights lead to life choices and not vice versa. And that's something that we have raised with both sides in our response to the joint report, which we've put out at the end of January. As far as sort of an overall view of the agreement that was reached in the joint report, I'll say what I think is the good news. There was agreement on some very technical issues, in particular in relation to social security, as the ambassador has mentioned, pensions and health insurance. And that's all very positive, in particular for the group of us who are not economically active or retired. But I think there's less good news in the common understanding for the nearly 80% of us who work. And we were therefore rather reassured to see that the European Parliament, in its 13th of December resolution, agreed with us on that. And while they did sign off on sufficient progress in their resolution, they noted that there were still outstanding issues, which is also our argument. So, on the outstanding issues, as the ambassador has explained, the aim of the common understanding is to protect the rights of citizens, and as far as UK citizens in the EU are concerned, in the country of residence, but only in the country of residence. And of course, at the moment, we have rights of free movement across the EU. It's true to say that there was an offer on the table in return for free movement for British citizens in the EU, a lifelong right of return for EU citizens in the UK. But what we're concerned about is whether that offer will stay on the table and whether in the next 6 months it will be raised again, and that fundamental issue of free movement will be raised again by the UK government before a final agreement is reached in, we expect, October of this year. Free movement is really important to our members. Not just lawyers like me, but across a whole range of professions and activities, from caterers and lorry drivers to IT contractors and people who've set up startups here in Berlin. So it's absolutely fundamental that we get free movement and within the scope of the final withdrawal agreement and before 2019. And that this does not get bumped into the next phase of the future agreement, because that could take a very long time to negotiate. I think it's particularly important, free movement, I should mention, to self-employed people and for those providing cross-border services. Then the lack of agreement on free movement has a knock-on effect for a whole range of other areas. This includes professional qualifications and economic rights, which the ambassador has mentioned. The problem is that where there has been agreement on professional qualifications and economic rights, it's only in the country of residence or the country where you have the decision of recognition of your qualifications. And obviously, it has this, for those who are working cross-border, it is key to have these rights across the EU 27. The second really big issue to come out of the common understanding is how we secure our status. So what happened in the common understanding was that the EU actually accepted the UK's proposal of settled status for EU citizens in the UK. Now what that means is that instead of confirming existing rights of EU citizens in the UK, their status will be conditional on a successful application. They will have to prove their entitlement. And this was a major concession by the EU because it's a clear departure from EU law. And the bad news was that at the last minute, this conditional system became an option for UK citizens in the EU as well. It was a last-minute addition to the agreement. There wasn't any consultation on it, and it wasn't in line with the EU's original proposal, which was to confirm our existing rights. And it does seem to be a direct result of the UK's negotiating position, which was to insist that the EU citizens in the UK had to make a conditional application. Two other really big points of substance of family reunification. The ambassadors mentioned what family reunification will be possible, but for future family members, there's a question mark. But there's also a question mark for returning UK citizens who return from an EU 27 country back to the UK. Are we going to have to, if we go back with non-British family to the UK, are we going to have to go through strict UK immigration rules? And this will apply to EU and non-EU potentially. Then, not to forget the younger demographic, students. And I think that there's very little really in the common understanding about the position of students on clarifying exactly what happens now on recognition of qualifications, especially for those starting their studies before Brexit and finishing post-Brexit. Similar issues about fees going forward, Erasmus obviously, and then what happens to young people who leave their country of residence to study before Brexit. How is this going to affect their residence rights in the country where they are resident now in the EU 27? Those are the issues of substance, but obviously there's also some process issues, and I'll just go through those very quickly. The first point is, as I said, this isn't a final agreement because the principle that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed applies here. And so far, the citizens' rights part of the negotiations has not been ring-fenced in the event that there were to be no deal on the rest. The second point, I mentioned that we're concerned about what's going to happen in terms of raising outstanding issues, and that's partly because there's no distinct strand for citizens' rights in this next phase of negotiations as there was in the first phase. And that could just mean that the outstanding issues on citizens' rights get lost among the morass of trade issues to be discussed about the future relationship. And the third point is, as always in these sort of agreements, the devil is in the detail. And all of this now has to be put in detailed legal language in order to ensure that these rights have direct effect and that you can enforce them before the courts in future. I probably should say something quickly at the end about transition. As the ambassador has explained, the rights of free movement will continue to apply for EU citizens in the UK and moving to the UK and UK citizens moving to the EU during transition. But it appears the position of the UK is that the rights of those who arrive after March 2019 will be different to those who arrived before. Well, this causes some problems, I think, and those problems are fourfold. I mean, first of all, if the UK is benefiting from the continuation of single market legislation, the fundamental freedoms, and giving that certainty to businesses, then presumably that ought to apply as well for citizens. Secondly, the position in the UK on EU citizens arriving in the UK has obviously a knock-on effect for UK citizens going to the EU because the principle of reciprocity applies here. And I'm sure there may be some young people who still want to be leaving during the transition to study, to work, and live in other countries. And then third and fourth are really sort of legal and practical problems. You could end up now with three different statuses. The people who came before March 2019, the people who came during the transition, and the people who come after the end of transition. that gets very complicated. And how do you actually identify who's in which group? So in conclusion, our view is citizens' rights are not resolved yet, and we will expect the UK to be pushing very hard in the next phase of negotiations on the outstanding issues, particularly those that I've mentioned. And then I'll just leave you with a question which relates to the case in the Netherlands that maybe some of you have seen reported in the news the last week or so, and that's all about the fundamental nature of EU citizenship. So the question is, if EU citizenship is our fundamental status, can this citizenship and all the rights attached to it really be withdrawn from us? Thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, this gives me an opportunity to address one of the main points that Jane made, which was, as you put it, the issue of citizens' rights has not been resolved yet, because what we have is a joint understanding. It's a political deal which was reached last December. But I would say, as I said in my introductory comments, that this was the area of negotiations last year where the common political will of both sides to sort it out and provide some clarity and some certainty for citizens on both sides was very clear. And there was a very strong will to do that. And work is now moving ahead pretty fast, I hear, in Brussels to put that political deal into legal language. Of course, it won't be finally legally binding and absolutely clear until both sides have sort of signed on the dotted line, which may be some time away. But my personal expectation is that, you know, even in a no-deal scenario, it's very hard to imagine that the two sides would not wish to implement this particular package of rights which they have negotiated with each other, because there is a strong shared will there to provide to remove some of the uncertainty which currently exists for citizens on both sides. So it's not legal certainty at this stage, but there is a very strong political commitment.